Kevin Gostola. I'm the curator of the Dissenter newsletter, also the managing editor of Shatterproof, and it's good to see all of you. Unfortunately, this is not a pleasant occasion to be providing an update to you, but it's good to see all the lurkers, all the people who are paid subscribers of the Dissenter newsletter, everyone who reads the Dissenter newsletter and shares it, anyone who's stumbling upon this. Thank you. I'm glad to have you, and I'm glad that you're interested in this update on drone whistleblower Daniel Hale. Drone whistleblower Daniel Hale, who was convicted. He pled guilty to violating the Espionage Act in order to prevent prison time, doing prison time for a longer amount than what he was sentenced. He was sentenced to 45 months in prison back on July 27th. And he provided drone documents to Jeremy Scahill. And he used to be, but before he released these documents, he was in the Air Force, and he was involved in the targeting of high value. The U.S. government would say they were alleged terrorists. These are people who they put on kill lists. And he saw the carnage. He saw the damage, the impact of carrying out these drone strikes, and how they often didn't hit the people who were intended, and instead did the kind of harm that we saw on full display on August 29th with the Kabul strike, in Afghanistan, the strike that really marked the end of the Afghanistan war in an incredible way. Daniel Hale was transferred from Northern Neck Regional Jail on October 1st and was brought to United States Penitentiary Marion, which is in southern Illinois, and he arrived there by October 6th. This is according to his support team, Team Daniel Hale. None of this information that I am talking about in this update today comes from Daniel Hale. I have not spoken to Daniel Hale. He has not abused his communications so that I could get this information. I know that the Bureau of Prisons is always seeking new ways that they can retaliate and make the lives of people who stand up for themselves miserable. But I did not talk to Daniel Hale, so he does not deserve whatever the warden or anyone else is planning for him in response to this video or coverage of his move to the Communications Management Unit, which is the news today, which is what I want to talk to you all about, because Daniel Hale was supposed to go to Federal Medical Center Butner in North Carolina, much like what happened with Reality Winner when she was sentenced to prison. Reality Winner disclosed some physical or medical problems that she had and sought a facility that could give her some modest form of treatment while she was incarcerated. And so she did time. She served her sentence in a facility in Texas called Federal Medical Center Carswell. And Daniel Hale, who is in need of medical treatment, suffering or having post-traumatic stress from his time in the military, was under the impression after an agreement that he was going to be sent to Butner. Butner's a low security prison. The judge did not order him to be sent to Butner, but that was the understanding as he waited and waited and waited at Northern Neck. 2 months went by, and then he was moved to this facility in Marion. It's one of two facilities in the United States that has what's called communications management units. These are units that are set up for extraordinarily restrictive housing of those who are, well, they're supposed to be people who were convicted of terrorism or terrorism-related offenses. Often it disproportionately impacts Muslims. You see Muslim individuals are the ones most represented, about 60%, according to the Center for Constitutional Rights, which has an ongoing lawsuit at this moment against the due process violations that take place against those who are put in these units. So Daniel Hale arrived. He was put into quarantine, they believe, because the Bureau of Prisons is still following COVID-19 protocol. And then they learn after he is able to make a phone call that Daniel Hale is in a CMU. That tends to happen. What happens is the authorities do not tell you that they are sending you to be put in a CMU. You have no ability to challenge your designation before you are sent to be placed in this unit. This unit was conceived in the mid-2000s while President George W. Bush was still in office. And it's a part of the war on terrorism. And as I've spent the last couple months reflecting on the impact of the war on terrorism 20 years since the September 11th attacks. This is part of it. The way in which the war on terrorism crept into how people are incarcerated in the United States. And it now seems that based on what has happened to Daniel Hale, a drone whistleblower, someone who exposed the targeted assassination complex within the Pentagon, that he is being put in a unit and facing this abuse in an unprecedented way. It is extraordinary. I've covered almost every single case under the Espionage Act, especially those which involve people who are whistleblowers or leakers. No matter how you view them, they are sources. They're people who provided documents to journalists or news media organizations, or they provided some testimony that was quoted. They were seeking to put out information that was in the public interest. And nobody has been incarcerated in a CMU. This is the first case. John Kiriakou is an important example to put alongside what is going on with Daniel Hale because, well, for one, John Kiriakou was a kind of mentor for Daniel Hale during the time that he was facing prosecution. If you don't know who John is, he's a CIA whistleblower. He went on ABC News in 2007 and confirmed that the Bush administration was, in fact, engaged in waterboarding and that it was an official policy. And he called it torture. And then he became a target, someone that those inside the intelligence agencies, people like John Brennan, wanted to punish or retaliate against for speaking out. John Kiriakou was put in this position where he had no choice and had to plead guilty to violating the Intelligence Identities Protection Act. He took a 30-month sentence to ensure that he did not do a lengthier amount of time in prison and went to Loretto prison in Pennsylvania. And there, it was his understanding when he arrived, he would be put in this camp, a work camp facility that's it's a satellite camp. It's not actually inside of the prison. And it's much more cushier. And, prison isn't anything to go, it's not like a recreational facility or a spa, but it's much better. It would have been much better if he was in this work camp than the prison. And he gets there and he finds they have deemed him a threat to public safety, and he is put in the low security prison, the actual prison, and he has no way to challenge that he is not in the work camp. So we're seeing a repeat here, but this is far worse than what happened to John Kiriakou. John Kiriakou was able to write letters from Loretto. He was able to speak to people. And the restrictions that are going to be imposed on Daniel Hale because he is in this CMU are intense. You have 1 hour of recreation time. You do not have any interaction with any prisoners. You are cut off from the outside world. There is an FBI agent that monitors your communications. They inspect your mail. They approve who you are able to have contact with in the outside world. If they choose to, they can limit your interactions to only immediate family. And what that means is that Daniel Hale has been or will be or could be effectively cut off from his entire support network. The people back in Washington, D.C. and parts of Virginia, maybe up and down the East Coast, who had been there for him and supported him while he had this cloud of prosecution hanging over him. This case, remember, it goes all the way back to 2014, 2015. And he appears in National Bird, this documentary from Sonia Kennebec, a really important film if you haven't seen it. And then he doesn't know if he's going to be indicted. His home is raided. He's no longer working as a contractor for Leidos, which is where he worked after he was in the Air Force. And he is wondering, what's going to happen? Is the Justice Department going to charge me? And then in 2019, about a month after WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is indicted, or the indictment against Julian Assange is made public, then Daniel Hale finds that he is going to be the subject of an Espionage Act prosecution. So he needs these people around him suffering from post-traumatic stress. He has other problems when it comes to holding down a job. He needs friends. He needs people who can be his support network. And they're there for him all the way through when he pleads guilty. And then they're there to recommend that he tell a story to the New York Magazine. An exceptional feature was published by Kerry Howley for this magazine that told his side and stood up against the character attacks he was suffering from prosecutors like the big shithead Gordon Kromberg, who was the lead on this case and is also involved in going after WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. And the vindictiveness, they helped him stand up toward the vindictiveness that was present in this case while President Donald Trump was in office. And he wasn't there anymore. So Joe Biden comes on and he allows this. His Justice Department, Attorney General Merrick Garland, allows this to continue through the summer. His psychiatrist rats him out to the pretrial services. Pretrial services learns confidential attorney-client privileged information between a doctor and patient that is used to put him in jail before he is sentenced, and treats him like a danger to himself when his friends and other whistleblowers who came to support him knew that he could manage and he was not an immediate harm to himself. They put him in Alexandria Detention Center. This is the facility where Chelsea Manning attempted to commit suicide before she was released a few days later. And she was in there because she was resisting a grand jury subpoena to testify against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange and other staff members of WikiLeaks. So Daniel Hale is sentenced on July 27th. Those people who have been a support network show up, are there on the day of hearing, and then he is sent to Northern Neck Regional Jail, and they're able to communicate with him. He talks with them, no problem whatsoever. And now he's in a CMU at USP Marion, and his communications are restricted, like he is a terrorist, like he's somebody who committed a violent crime, like he is a high-risk inmate. They see him as a danger to others, that he can't be put in general population. But I'm confident that he hasn't had any ability to challenge this designation, and it's pretty clear at this point that his due process rights have been trampled. His attorney, one of his attorneys who represents him, Jesselyn Raddick, communicated with me and said that she had contacted the facility to try and speak to 2 case managers, and those case managers did not return her calls. And she called this unprofessional and borderline unconstitutional. So someone who represents him legally still waiting for the official explanation as to why he has been put in a CMU. So there are a couple additional things going on in the background as Daniel Hale endures this, as Daniel Hale suffers this predicament. The Center for Constitutional Rights has an appeal, and in fact, today, on October 18th, they were before a DC Court of Appeals, and I was able, for my report on this, to get comment from Rachel Mirapol, the senior staff attorney that is arguing against the CMUs and how horrible and inhuman and cruel they are to people who are incarcerated in them. And she basically said that the CMUs should absolutely not be used in this manner, especially against somebody who has post-traumatic stress and is in the kind of mental or physical health that Daniel Hale is in. And so I'd like to just take a moment because I'm going to look away from the camera ever so slightly, but you'll still be able to see me, and read from their appeal, which was submitted. And it basically, it features, so this case represents multiple plaintiffs who were kept in the CMUs. I don't think they are all in the CMUs anymore. This person who is the lead plaintiff, his name is Kifa Jayuzi. And he is 58, 59 years old now. When he was in the CMU, he was in his late 40s, 50 years old. And he's from Detroit, Michigan. He's a Jordanian, of the Jordanian descent, but he's an American citizen, and he's a practicing Muslim. So the thing to understand about Daniel Hale is he functions as a kind of balancer for the United States government. This is something that Center for Constitutional Rights and other groups have worked to expose, which is that people who are white get placed in the CMUs in order to try and compensate for that disproportionality, the amount that Muslims are represented in here. And I think there's only ever like 60 or 70 people who are kept in the CMUs in these 2 facilities. It's Marion, and I don't know that I mentioned the other one yet, but it's in Terre Haute, Indiana. And so Kifa Jayuzi is a typical kind of prisoner, unlike Daniel, but what you'll learn here is that it's not that like he deserves it. So when I say that these are terrorist units, I put it in quotes deliberately. These are people convicted of terrorist offenses, but not all of them are terrorists. Some of them, like I don't know every single case. I don't know every single person who's in the CMUs. There are people who did commit acts of violence, and they're being put in these solitary confinement conditions. And I think it's a separate conversation, irrespective of their crimes, whether people should be punished in this manner, in addition to the life sentences or the kinds of lengthy sentences that are issued for people who commit violence against people. So Jayuzi was alleged to have engaged in criminal conduct, primarily involved in financial contributions to charities. A sentencing judge found that he ceased involvement in any criminal conspiracy in 1998. This is from CCR's appeal. Jayuzi was convicted of conspiracy to murder, kidnap, and maim in a foreign country, and conspiracy to provide material support to terrorism in August 2007, and sentenced to 12 years and 8 months imprisonment. Although Mr. Jayuzi has received no major disciplinary infractions and absolutely no communications-related disciplinary infractions, he was transferred to the CMU at Terre Haute in June 2008. He was then transferred to the CMU at Marion in October 2010 and has been there ever since. Mr. Jayuzi has abandoned any affiliation with extremist or violence-oriented religious or political organizations. Indeed, Mr. Jayuzi is opposed to violent or extremist religious and political ideologies. So this was a filing from back in 2012. This is who he is. He is the lead person who has put himself out there to challenge the CMUs. There are others. They are trying to get Daniel McGowan reinstated for this case, or I think Daniel McGowan is or may still be in this appeal. But this is these people who are trying to challenge the very units that Daniel Hale is in, this very system that Daniel Hale has been put in I think, retaliation for his ability to defend himself, his ability to have a support network, his ability to put out these statements, his ability to stand before the court and be a conscientious person and show the court that he has very principled reasons for the act in which he engaged. And so I think that's why he's in a CMU. And so what does this mean for, let's say, a really high profile case that is occurring across the Atlantic Ocean and is taking place in United Kingdom with Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder, who is jailed in Belmarsh? What does this mean for him? Well, I'm going to get to that in an update in a next video, but I'll just say right now that the appeal hearing is coming up before the High Court of Justice, and the CMUs are conditions that are maybe not as bad as special administrative measures that are documented, which were challenged during the extradition hearing, played a part in the district judge denying the extradition request. But the CMUs are not, that this isn't a good thing for the US government. In my view, it's possible that the US government just made it harder for themselves to argue that Julian Assange will not be harmed or treated inhumanely, or that his extradition will not be oppressive for mental and physical health reasons. That's their choice. I mean, they should be talking to each other. They should make sure that certain people don't take actions that make it difficult for them to carry out their callousness. But they really should have been on the same page with this one, because Daniel Hale being put in a CMU is probably a thing that the Assange legal team can use to their benefit to protect Julian Assange from being extradited to the United States. And I bet that they will. I bet that they will be talking about communication management units when they are before the High Court of Justice. So, I talked to Thomas Drake, who was on the list of people that could be contacted, that Daniel could talk with and receive support. He doesn't think he'll be able to be on the list. John Kiriakou is a convicted felon. I mean, that's not how I view him. I don't see him as that. He's a CIA whistleblower, but the Bureau of Prisons certainly sees him as a convicted felon. He was in their system. They're probably not going to let him talk to Daniel Hale the full time that he is in prison. And then Lisa Ling, who I spoke with, is a friend, a close friend, a drone whistleblower, also featured in National Bird. She doesn't know if she's going to be allowed on Daniel Hale's list. There are friends. Nor Mir, fortunately, a close friend, is able to communicate with Daniel right now, and they are able to get updates to the Daniel Hale support network. But how long does this last? How is this the extent of the vindictiveness of the Bureau of Prisons, or is there more that they want to do? I mean, how authoritarian do they want to behave against Daniel Hale? How outside the confines of what's supposed to be the rule of law, how much do they want to stick an eye in the principles of due process that are supposed to exist for people who are in prison. And then we'll see. He's got quite a lot of time to be in prison until 2024, mid 2024. He's going to be held in these conditions, and they can choose how much he is cut off from the outside world. They can choose how little he speaks to people. It could be 3 15-minute calls a month, or it could be 2 15-minute calls per month. There are no visits right now because COVID-19 protocols are still in force at USP Marion. So he can't see anybody. But even if he did see anybody, they don't allow contact visits. So any family who come to see him, he can't hug them. If he wanted to form a relationship and have a girlfriend or a partner or something like that, he would be able to see that person, but they could not touch. They would not be able to hug each other, and he would not be able to hold their hand. Fortunately, he doesn't have children because this is a unit. The system is a way that the prison keeps incarcerated individuals separated from their children. Children are not allowed to hug their fathers or their mothers if they are incarcerated in a CMU. So this is the system in which Daniel finds himself, and I think we have a lot to stay on top of here because he is going to need a lot of support that the Bureau of Prisons, the warden at USP Marion, and other staff there at the prison want him to think he doesn't have. They're going to want him to believe he's all alone. But I think that there are people who are going to continue to do work that is necessary to show solidarity. I'll continue this journalism to provide updates on Daniel Hale's case. So let me see if there's anything from any of you that, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to sign off here. I'm just going to keep it very specific to this update. And as I said, I'll come back at the end of the month. We have Assange, but I don't want Assange to upstage what we're doing with what needs to be said and what needs to be focused on with Daniel Hale. And they just happen to have a little bit of a synergy. So it's worth mentioning him in this context. And, of course, this is Biden's case. This is Biden's case. Donald Trump indicted Daniel Hale, but Biden's Justice Department chose to go forward with prosecuting Daniel Hale the same way they chose to go forward with continuing the push for extraditing Julian Assange. And they didn't have to have the sentencing date, the sentencing with Daniel Hale. They didn't have to do this. And the Justice Department could step in right now. Andrei Matavusian is the Assistant Director for Correctional Programs. That's Andrei Matavusian. He is the Assistant Director for Correctional Programs. This is the individual who we believe designates people for CMUs, who signs off on these decisions, who makes the policy for who gets put in these CMUs. So this Gitmo North, as it's sometimes been referred to, is it's his responsibility. And there should be an effort to find a way to get the office to give the full justification, even though we know there is not one. But what are their reasons? What is it that Daniel did that landed him in the CMU? Maybe it's just that he is who he is. Maybe it's just that he's somebody who's a whistleblower who challenged the drone program. That might be all it takes. But they're supposed to try to slide this into one of their regulations to say that, they didn't want him talking to other people in general population about X, Y, or Z, or come up with some other reason within their code. And so let's see what they have. I think they should make that public. And I know that people who represent him are going to do the best they can to force that into the light, although they want to keep it secret. So thank you all for tuning in. I don't see any particular questions. I will do this, which is put this up at the bottom here and say that this is the newsletter, The Dissenter. It's a project of Shadowproof, of which I'm a managing editor. I curate this newsletter, and every week I do a couple postings. And if you subscribe, you're able to support the kind of journalism in which I just talked about in this last half hour. If you're a paid subscriber, you're able to comment on the newsletter, engage in discussions with me and others who are paid subscribers of the newsletter, and you'll get this emailed to you. You'll be the first to know of these developments with Daniel Hale, with Julian Assange, and with others who are targets under the Espionage Act and subject to this war on whistleblowers. We're talking about real whistleblowers, not the people who are rich and are able to finance their own public relations campaigns and get it onto CNN or do 60 Minutes. We're talking about people who are vulnerable, who really need our attention and need our support. And those are the whistleblowers that are the focus at the Dissenter. These are people who I think we need to stand with. And so if you go there and subscribe, you can get this newsletter. And then I'm working on developing, I'll have an update soon about what we're going to do. There is a weekly show that has been paired with the Dissenter newsletter where I cover whistleblower stories from the past week. I'm working on doing some fine tuning with it after having produced that show for well over a year. So I'll have some things to show with that in the next couple of weeks. In the meantime, it's good to see all of you. I'm really grateful for the few dozen of you here who tuned in live to this update. And then this will be archived, and anybody who wants to play it back and get some detail about what's happening with Daniel Hale can do so. And they will be able to get the skinny on what's going on here. It's awful. And I think Daniel needs us more than ever right now. This is the time in which we need to not give up paying attention. Whistleblower cases do not end when the whistleblower pleads guilty under the Espionage Act or when they are sentenced and they make statements on their behalf that tell us all why they did what they did. The whistleblower story, the whistleblower prosecutions, they continue in prison. This doesn't end until they are released. Even then, sometimes it continues, as we've seen periodically with Chelsea Manning. So thank you for tuning in to this update, and I'll see you again on this channel soon. See you around.